When you look at geographic concepts and sort of theory that I want to go over, but in this case, it's actually more terminology. Um, since the geographers tend to borrow most of their theory from other disciplines. So most of the theory, for example, I learned as a geographer was stuff I already knew as an anthropologist or archaeologist. But the concepts in geography are different. The anthropologists are interested in people, but anthropologists very frequently give you very little idea of the world that those people function in. In other words, if you would, anthropology, I think it's true also of sociology, certainly true of psychology, is they tend to be so fixated on the interaction between people, is they don't tend to pay a lot of attention to, if you would, the stage that this is all played out on. Geographers, if they have any bias at all, sometimes get more hung up on the stage that's played out on rather than the interactions that are happening. So they're very much two different areas of looking at the same event in very different ways. A good example would be if you went back to that little bit of the Morris dance that I showed you. The Morris dance was done obviously in some sort of a main street or shopping area or something like that in Scotland's, I know in West Counties of England, I would assume somewhere. Anthropologists would be interested almost entirely in the dance itself and maybe to a certain limited extent the reaction of the audience to the dance, though even then most anthropologists would only be interested in the actual dance. Geographers would probably be more interested in where it's taking place and the interaction that everyone has towards it than they would maybe than the dance itself. Now, both of these are useful approaches, and one reason I have my particular background is I find them as being complementary. But they do tend to look at things differently, and so in many ways. And so the terms that I'm going to give you this time are the terms that geographers use. And again, they're very, very common use. I hear them all the time, and they're usually abused and misused, just like those theoretical concepts we were talking last time. So remember within that context, the two main ones for our purposes are the idea of cultural geography and historical geography. These aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, you get into a chicken and egg in terms of which is within the other. Cultural geography is looking at the aspects of the human group on the landscape. Now, you have to remember the geographers are very clear about this. Landscapes don't have to be real landscapes. If you ever read Alice in Wonderland, that's an entirely imaginary landscape. But on one hand, it's also very real. Of course, it's been generated any number of movies and such like that. The Harry Potter things, if you remember when you were a kid, are another example of imaginary landscapes, but they can be very real to people, and people have them very strongly fixated in their head. And you classically see this if they were to do a new Harry Potter movie, a whole mess of folks would be checking to make sure they didn't mess with the image they already had of it. This is a huge problem. I think they call them Trekkies, folks into Star Trek and such like that, or Star Wars, where they have such a strong sense of what it's supposed to be like, even though it's entirely imaginary, that they get really pissed off if someone else's vision of it isn't the same as theirs. So this is all part of cultural geography. We'll see this when we get into the whole digital stuff and things like Second Life. It's a fascinating example of cultural geography that's entirely digital. But that doesn't mean it's not compelling. Historical geography is an examination of how cultural landscapes change over time. So if you would, it's sort of like adding a little bit of Marxism to the idea of culture. And so in cultural geography, you look at the different decisions that were made over, for example, how landscape we use, maybe how built environments replace other environments, and how they oftentimes also interact in very complex ways that we don't tend to think about a lot. So historical geography is obviously grounded in history, but it's still an examination of landscape. So this makes it very different than a lot of so what you might call pure history, which is usually driven by people. Historical geographers see people as the collective group that shapes a landscape or perceives a landscape in a particular way and makes choices based on that. But they don't get too hung up on the idea that the people can function on the landscape unless the landscape is somehow involved. So they see this as very much a part of the complex that makes up geography, which is the idea that you have people, you can have perception, but on the other hand, you have the actual functional reality of place. So again, the idea, as I mentioned last time, with the idea of folks building on sand dunes on the North Shore, that's on one hand, the perception of the, especially Western perception of seascapes, of ocean views, of beaches, especially beaches in the perceived Eden paradise of Hawaii, is such that you don't really pay enough attention to the reality that this actually is a physical landscape that has physical things called sand dunes, which are put there by ocean waves and taken away by ocean waves. So they're very much dynamic and changing. You try to put a house on it, you say this is permanent, and it's like, good luck with that one. So this would be historical geography, saying changing use of a landscape. So two terms that are intimately related, but there usually means that you're sort of focusing on or putting more emphasis on one aspect or the other. Landscape is central to geography. Geography is the study of landscapes. And landscapes are, again, one of these classic things that if you look at this definition here, it's a totally useless definition. It's totally accurate, but you can't take that definition and say, well, this is that type of landscape. Because right at the beginning, if you notice, it says symbolic. And if you remember when we were talking about earlier, symbols are also always arbitrary, and there's no necessary relation between symbols and meaning. So when you're looking at landscapes, you're looking at something that is very much going to be different depending on who you're talking to, who's looking at it, even though the physical environment might be exactly the same. So landscapes are what geographers do, especially like me, cultural geographers, we do landscapes. And this is why when cultural geographers do landscapes, we spend a lot of time talking about what the actual physical landscape is, in other words, what's actually going on there, but also the different groups and the different way that people and groups view that landscape. In other words, they're different cultural landscapes. So very rarely will you find one cultural landscape for a particular physical location. It's almost invariably a myriad, and oftentimes just a stunning multitude of landscapes. And here in Hawaii is a perfect case in point. Something like Waikiki more accurately, or Waititi more accurately, would be a perfect case of a cultural landscape that, good luck trying to come up with sort of a synoptic description of what it is, of what the cultural landscape of the Waikiki is in less than, 500 pages, I would think, minimum. It's also interactive, as Groth pointed out. So I've just got a bunch of different definitions here. They're not mutually exclusive, and again, but they're trying to give you some grasp of it. Probably the best is simply the fact that it's the cultural aspects of a landscape, but it's also, of course, the way that we perceive the landscape. So again, if you think of a national park like, say, Yosemite in California, it's stereotyped by virtue of the natural physical features of that landscape. And people take pictures of it and they paint it, but they also climb on it and they also go out there to see it. And so all of this would be part of the cultural landscapes of Yosemite. And actually the group that does a really good job of talking about this the best would probably be the National Park Service, because they're in charge of many of the sort of collectively cultural landscapes that we see in the United States in the Park Service. Built environment. The key difference, if you notice about this, the cultural landscape doesn't actually have to be constructed. It can be totally without human intervention, but that just means that people have a perception of it. You could probably argue legitimately there's all sorts of cultural landscapes of Mars, for example. While people have sent things to Mars, we really haven't modified most of the planet in any way, shape, or form. Built environment, on the other hand, is you're actually looking very specifically at a subset of the cultural landscape. So built environments are part of cultural landscapes. They're the actual ways that we manifest what we do to the landscape. Now, you have to remember a key part of this is oftentimes the unintentional aspects of what we manifest. And there's just, at least 20 examples pop into my head just when I bring this up. But a good example, again, would be Waikiki. That beach is entirely artificial. The sand was originally brought from other parts of Oahu. Now it's brought from Maui. So the sand doesn't belong to Oahu. That part of Oahu is a mudflat. So it was modified. Once people decided it was a beach, then into the Euro-American concept of beach, beaches don't consist of mud. Beaches consist of sand. And because it's a, quote, tropical paradise, unquote, it has to be a sand beach. And so you have to make it into a sand beach. And so you do. And one of the ironies of Waikiki is you're constantly trying to remake a sand beach that doesn't want to be there because it isn't supposed to be there. And a large part of what is Waikiki, from the Waikiki Flood Control Project to Waikiki Tourist Association, everything is based on different perceptions of that particular physical environment of where water comes and meets land on a shoreline. So built environment is the things we do to it. And in some cases, it might be the ways that we try to protect it and the way that we maybe fence it off so it doesn't get changed, unquote, which of course still changes stuff. So built environment is much more complex than intentionality. Intentionality is part of built environment, but a lot of built environment is sort of unanticipated side consequences that if you ask the original folks that were doing something to the environment, it never occurred to them that would happen. And they never took it into account. All of that is what geographers look at. People like me, I specialize in built environment. That's what I do. The best example I know of this is Meiningen, which I think has one of the articles for your reading. If not, we'll see if I can find it. Meiningen was one of the ones in the 1970s when people really got into, especially in the United States, into looking at cultural landscapes. In Europe, cultural landscapes have been a major part of geography since the discipline started. There's tons and tons of work and tons of people in Europe, French, British, whatever, that could look at cultural landscapes. And you can go to YouTube or anything to find like a gazillion, videos and courses and all sorts of stuff on looking at cultural landscapes. Americans were really late to this. And I think in large part because most Americans are largely, of course, recent immigrants, with a few exceptions, including some of my relatives. Americans only arrived here in the last 200-300 years, if not the last 50 or 100 years. So they don't really see the cultural landscape here in terms of past or historic landscapes as being part of the world that they're a part of. They see contemporary cultural landscapes as the world they've built, which, as we'll see later, gets into this huge concept, things like subdivisions and such like that. And so what you get is guys like Meiningen, who I think was at Ohio State or something in the 1950s and 60s, 70s, were the first to really sort of write about sort of the aspects of cultural landscape from a very sort of structured analytical point of view in terms of different ways that cultural landscapes could be interpreted or viewed or analyzed. He came up with a shopping list, which is still really, really good when you're looking at a place. And a good example would be if Waikiki, for example, if you're looking at Waikiki, then Waikiki obviously is an ideology. It's a whole set of sort of ideological ethos about, tropical environments and escapism. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of Leahi versus Diamond Head. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It's very much a place, God knows the number of places that are, have Waikiki in their name, or the ways that you image or try to sell Waikiki. It's a huge part of the tourism industry here. Waikiki's worth a lot of money. That's why there's so much panic in the folks in Waikiki when you start seeing the beach disappear. They just absolutely freak out because they see it as wealth and capital. They could probably tell you exactly whatever, bottle of sand is worth in Waikiki. Waikiki is power and control. The fact that you could turn a mud flat that was privately or public, sort of collectively owned, into basically a government operation, largely driven by the private sector, by the tourism, industry, is a huge example of power and control and struggle. The Duke Kahanamoku statue is a classic example of power and control in Waikiki. The landscape is history. The past of Waititi versus the modern reality of Waikiki is entirely generated in terms of the history of this place. Waikiki is an aesthetic. The number of videos that you'll find of people using drones and flying over the beach of Waikiki and how imaged that is. It's seen as aesthetically pretty. People come here for thousands of miles and spend thousands of dollars to look at the beach of Waikiki. Landscape is social rank and prestige. If you could afford to have a townhouse or a condo overlooking Waikiki versus looking over the Alawai, that certainly says something about your social rank and prestige. So Waikiki is a perfect example. It's maybe once a little too close. So what I want to do is we're going to do one of those sort of slide show and tells using some of Meining's landscape in a place that I don't think you're probably familiar with, which is some of the work that I do in China. Okay, so I guess this didn't happen the first way. So looking at this again, what you have is this is the Forbidden City. You're entering into the Forbidden City. This is the Forbidden City, or actually Purple City in Beijing. This was the imperial headquarters. It's about, I think it's about 120 buildings inside of here. This takes up about, I don't know, I'm going to say 10 to 12 blocks entirely. Now, this was the center of the imperial structure of the Chinese state from basically 1600 to 1911. The Chinese state, unlike its Western counterparts, basically every decision was made in the entire country of China was made within the walls of the city. So when you look at this construct, and this was constructed largely by the Qing dynasty, the last group that ran China, they built the city for the purpose of making clear to everyone in China that they ran China, and China was going to be run from here. And so the vast majority of Chinese, even if they lived in Beijing, wouldn't go anywhere near this place. It was patrolled by hundreds, if not thousands, of guards. You could literally be, executed on the spot just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was a huge statement of political power. This is one of the great things about looking at Chinese authority is the fact that Chinese authority has been very explicit in the way that you use the built environment to reinforce images of status and power and authority. So this is an ideological landscape, the ideology of the centralized state. It's a, enormous statement of power and wealth and resources. You can have this stuff built and have these things built and have them maintained and have literally thousands of people running in and out of them. Everything about this thing was designed as a form of symbolic messaging to make it clear to everyone, the quote masses of China, who's in charge. It's the guy inside, not all the, hundreds of millions of people outside. Okay, that landscape is based on thousands of years of Chinese logic. This is probably the earliest spectacular manifestation of it. This is, if you're familiar with Xi'an or you've ever heard of it, this is the warriors, the terracotta warriors of Xi'an, or more accurately, the terracotta warriors of Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. So when the guys in the 1600s were building the Forbidden City in Beijing, it was based on this construct that was basically just about 1,800 years older, that had been built 14 dynasties earlier by the guy that basically decides to unify China. But one of the things he did very, very well is he was the one to first develop this idea of Polonk. You just set the landscape down and you make this landscape that just reminds everyone of authority. And the key part of this, and this is the area that we do our research in, is not these. These guys were actually in warehouses. You can't see the warehouses now because these were basically wooden warehouses, and these guys were all stored in them. And this is actually a relatively unimportant part of the actual first emperor's tomb. These guys were part of these sort of ancillary parts of the tomb. The main part of the tomb was the part where the emperor gets buried. So let's take a look at that. Okay, here's the first emperor's tomb. Easiest way to see this is in Google Earth. You actually go and look at it, or I'm sure you can find pictures of this. This hole here is fake. This whole hill is man-made. So this is a built environment. This whole area was flat. It was probably in millet, farming at the time. And what the first emperor did is when he decided, he was going to die fairly soon, is he actually went and ordered this entire mound made. Now so every aspect, this entire hill is literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people carrying buckets of dirt, woven buckets of dirt and piling them one after the other, layered with rocks there. Everything was carried by hand. And this hill now is only I think it's about 400 feet tall. But it's actually lost about 200 feet. So it actually went up to about here, watching my pointer, originally. So he went and built this entire artificial mountain. And then in the middle of that, underground, is the actual tomb of the first emperor. Now, the reason he did this is nothing like this had ever been done in China before. He wanted the whole world to remember after he passed away that this was the imperial world, and he was the one that had set up the imperial world, and he had the power to literally make mountains. And he did all this in roughly less than 12 years. So if you want to think about getting a bunch of people to do something, this is the way you do it. And this is a huge thing when you walk on here, especially when you realize this was the original landscape. Everything you see looking this way is artificial in the sense that it's a built environment. This is still an enormously powerful thing when you see it. If you're driving by it and you don't really pay attention, you just think, well, that's an odd looking hill, just because it's very symmetrical and it's in a flat spot. The hills are actually about 3 miles away. And then you look and you go like, holy crap, that's not a hill. That's actually a tomb. But the actual tomb isn't the outside. This wasn't put up until the 1960s or 70s as part of it when they made this into a tourist attraction. And even then, you don't see many tourists there because, unlike the terracotta warriors, which are about 6 or 8 kilometers over this way, there isn't a lot to see here. It's just a hill. The tomb's never been opened. And right now, the Chinese have no intent of opening the tomb. So whatever that was actually buried there is still underground. And so you've come up with all these things outside to basically amplify the fact that you could, by virtue of this ideology and power, you could do this. So if you go through a whole mining list of things, and you look at this thing and you realize that it ain't subtle. It's basically really in your face. It's a classic sort of blunt weapon, but it does a really, really good job of getting a very clear set of messages across. It's entirely symbolic, and it's basically just screams power in huge capital letters. And this is a good example of a cultural landscape and a built environment, but it's also an entirely ritualized environment. So again, from the outsider standpoint, they look at this, they wouldn't understand what he was trying to say. This was a message by Chinese for Chinese, but it was by Chinese for Chinese 2,000 years ago. The Forbidden City was by Chinese for Chinese, actually by Manchurians for Chinese about 300 years ago. But it was based on this same logic because this had become the standard, if you would, in later periods. And so the first emperor's tomb, the first emperor's tomb complex in Xi'an are, obviously from my standpoint, totally worth going to see. But especially if you're a geographer, they're just a stunning example of cultural landscapes. And when you talk about built environments, how you can, totally not mess around in terms of built environments. This thing, you want to put in context, this thing's about 3 times larger than the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And the Great Pyramid took a lot longer to put up than this thing did. So, this was a manifestation of someone basically saying, I've got it, and putting their stamp on the landscape so that, as far as he was concerned, forever after, as he could see it, people would remember who he was and the power of the central state of China.